In the midst of the events that marked the 20th century, few figures have generated as much attention, mystery, and debate as Adolf Hitler. For decades, his name has been accompanied by speeches, figures, and analyses that attempt to understand how he became one of the most influential characters of his time. However, beyond the uniform, politics, and war, there was also a person with daily habits, peculiar routines, obsessions, contradictions, and secrets kept in his private life. A man who slept little and badly, who maintained a particular relationship with sugar, who felt a deep affection for dogs, who never personally visited a concentration camp, who married at a decisive moment in his existence, and who frequently resorted to medical treatments and drugs, believing that in this way he found stability in the midst of chaos. Fact 1. Hitler was a vegetarian, but not always. Towards the end of his life, Adolf Hitler maintained a meat-free diet. It is not entirely clear when or why he began to follow this regime, since some accounts of his diet in the years prior to the world conflict still describe him eating meat products even in 1937. In 1938, his doctors imposed a meatless diet on him. From then on, both his regime and his public image as a vegetarian were promoted, and from 1942 he himself identified with that lifestyle. People who knew him closely and knew what he ate claim that during this period he completely gave up meat. And according to Albert Speer, who worked with him, he used vivid accounts of the suffering of animals at the table to convince others not to eat meat. In 2018, a French team analyzed a fragment of his skull and found no traces of meat fibers in the tartar of his teeth. Some current interpretations say that this dietary choice may have been related to his health, influenced by Wagner's theories, or even an emotional response to the death of his niece, although other sources insist that his main motivation was animal suffering. He was known to reject any mistreatment of animals and was against vivisection. A children's magazine in favor of the regime mentioned that the leader did not consume meat because of his love for animals and his general view of life, claiming that even as head of government, he remained attached to the animals he had had for years. They claimed that he strongly opposed any form of animal torture and that he wanted to end such practices. An article in 1937 published in the New York Times reported that it was known that Hitler did not eat meat, drink, or smoke. His meals almost always consisted of soup, eggs, vegetables, and sparkling water, although he occasionally tried ham and caviar. In another publication from the same year, it was mentioned that during a state dinner with Mussolini, he tried several dishes that included meat and toasted with German sparkling wine. It was also described that at his country house, his chef prepared multiple meatless recipes, which were rich both in flavor and in presentation. In the conversations recorded by his close circle between 1941 and 1944, Hitler referred to himself as a vegetarian. In one of those meetings, he said that the world of the future would be without meat. In another, he rejected the lamb dish that was offered to him, saying that his diet did not allow him to eat it. Joseph Goebbels also wrote in his diary that Hitler believed meat was harmful to people and that he intended to address this issue after the war. In the midst of the events that marked the 20th century, few figures have generated as much attention, mystery, and debate as Adolf Hitler. For decades, his name has been accompanied by speeches, figures, and analyses that attempt to understand how he became one of the most influential characters of his time. However, beyond the uniform, politics, and war, there was also a person with daily habits, peculiar routines, obsessions, contradictions, and secrets kept in his private life. A man who slept little and badly, who maintained a particular relationship with sugar, who felt a deep affection for dogs, who never personally visited a concentration camp, who married at a decisive moment in his existence, and who frequently resorted to medical treatments and drugs, believing that in this way he found stability in the midst of chaos. Fact 2. His real surname was not Hitler, but Schicklgruber. In 1837, Maria Anna Schicklgruber, a single woman of peasant origin, gave birth to a boy named Alois. Since the father was unknown, the child was registered with his mother's surname. Maria married 5 years later to Johann Georg Hiedler, a mill worker, but there was no legal change of the child's surname at that time. For much of his life, Alois bore the name Schicklgruber. It was not until 1876, when he was almost 40 years old, that he was formally registered as Hitler, after a legal procedure recognized him as the son of Johann Georg Hitler. The official registration was carried out thanks to the intervention of 3 people, including a relative from the maternal family. Although Johann Georg had already died, his brother was one of those who signed the document before a notary to have the change accepted. With this procedure, the surname was modified in the official records, and from then on, Alois used the new name in all his documents. That decision, apparently trivial, would have historical repercussions that no one could have foreseen at the time. The reason behind the choice of the name Hitler remains the subject of debate. It has been suggested that it may have been a variant of the surname Hiedler, which was already present in the stepfather's family. Other sources explain that in that region it was common for names to change slightly in spelling depending on who registered them, and at that time there were no strict rules about the orthography of surnames. Therefore, it cannot be stated with certainty whether it was a transcription error or a deliberate choice. When Alois Hitler had children, they automatically carried the surname already recorded in the official registries. Adolf, born in 1889, thus received the surname Hitler from birth, although in reality that name had not legally existed in the family before 1876. Technically, if the change had not been made, Adolf would have been called Adolf Schicklgruber, and his entire political career and public figure would have been known under that name. It is a detail that some historians find curious when analyzing how seemingly minor factors can have unexpected consequences in the future. In some school records from Adolf's youth, errors or variations in the spelling of his surname are found, such as Hitler or Heitler, which reflects that even during his student years, the spelling of the name was not completely stable. Nevertheless, the surname Hitler was the one that ultimately prevailed and became associated with his public figure. There is no evidence that Adolf was ashamed of his father's original name or that he tried to hide it, although he never made public references to that past. In certain circles, such as the memoirs of close acquaintances, it is mentioned that the name Schicklgruber was considered rustic or even comical, something that might have hindered the development of a strong political image if it had been maintained. Thus, the legal change of surname made by his father marked the family line from then on. Although it was not a widely commented fact at the time, the new name ended up being one of the most recognized and feared of the 20th century, something that could hardly have been imagined when the civil registry official first wrote Hitler in 1876. Fact 3. He wanted to be an artist but was rejected by an art school in 1907. An 18-year-old young man, enthusiastic about painting and drawing, arrived in Vienna with the firm intention of entering the Academy of Fine Arts. He had already abandoned his school studies in Linz, where his performance had been irregular and his interests had turned toward architecture, design, and painting. Although he showed confidence in his artistic talent, he carried with him only a few works to present as samples for the entrance examination. When he submitted his application to enter the academy, the examiners carefully observed his drawings but rejected him without hesitation. Although his technique was not completely deficient, the judges pointed out that he lacked imagination and originality, aspects considered fundamental for progressing in an artistic career. The decision took him by surprise. He applied again the following year with new works, but was once again dismissed. On that occasion, they even recommended that he seek a school of architecture, since some of his works showed skill in representing buildings but not people or living scenes. Even with the rejection, he decided to stay in Vienna, still holding the hope that with effort he might achieve a career in the art world. He lived on a small pension he received after his mother's death and in part from the sale of postcards he painted himself. He also copied landscapes from books and sold them to merchants or tourists. However, his income was limited, and over time his financial situation became increasingly precarious. During those years in Vienna, his life was erratic. He spent his days in libraries reading about history, architecture, and politics, while at night he slept in cheap lodgings or homeless shelters. His clothing was neglected and his general appearance reflected the deterioration caused by academic rejection, poverty, and personal frustration. Without technical training or institutional support, his attempts to live from art amounted only to basic subsistence. There is no evidence that he tried to enter another art institution after the second failure at the academy. This episode of his youth left an important mark on his biography. Some witnesses from his environment recalled that he often spoke of his disappointment with the academy and of how bureaucracy and artistic elitism had closed the doors to those without influence or titles. Although he never completely abandoned his interest in painting, his career as an artist never took off and was displaced by other ambitions that grew over time, especially his involvement in political and social debates, fueled by the readings he did during his stay in Vienna. Years later, when he already held positions of power, he still kept some of his works and occasionally spoke with some resentment about the academy that had excluded him. His rejection was not an isolated case. Several young people were rejected each year, but in his case, that fact coincided with a period of profound personal and ideological changes. That combination of failure, isolation, and the search for a greater purpose would mark the beginning of a new direction, completely different from the one he had imagined when he arrived in Vienna, loaded with drawings, confidence, and expectations. Fact 4. He fought in the First World War as a messenger. When the war broke out in the summer of 1914, Adolf Hitler was in Munich, living in modest conditions and still without a defined direction. As soon as general mobilization was declared, he volunteered for the German army. He was accepted into the 6th Bavarian Infantry Regiment, although he was an Austrian citizen, something unusual that did not raise objections from the German authorities. His enthusiasm was evident, and from the beginning, he showed himself disciplined and reserved without standing out socially, but always willing to obey orders. After brief training, he was sent to the Western Front, where he took part in the initial combats in Belgium and northern France. He soon distinguished himself by his willingness to take on dangerous tasks, especially as his battalion's messenger. This job consisted of carrying orders from the rear to the advanced positions, crossing areas exposed to enemy fire. Although it was not a direct combat role, it carried high risk, as it required moving on foot through open terrain under constant shelling or gunfire. Hitler performed it regularly and without hesitation, something noted by his superiors. During the course of the conflict, he was wounded twice. The first occurred in 1916, when he was hit in the leg by shrapnel during the Battle of the Somme. He was transferred to a hospital in Berlin and received a decoration for his conduct. He returned to the front after several months of recovery. In 1918, he suffered a second injury, this time caused by a mustard gas attack near Ypres. The exposure caused him vision problems, and he was evacuated to a hospital in Payswalk, where he was when the news of the armistice arrived in November of that same year. Throughout the war, he remained in the same regiment and never rose beyond the rank of corporal, something unusual given his length of service and the honorary mentions he received. He was decorated with the Iron Cross Second Class in 1915, and later with the First Class in 1918, a rare distinction for someone of his rank. Some historians have pointed out that his individual behavior was more valued by officers than his relations with other soldiers. In fact, many of his comrades remembered him as solitary, silent, and withdrawn, without forming strong bonds within the platoon. The war had a lasting effect on his worldview. Although he had not stood out for having defined political opinions before the conflict, his experiences in the trenches and his disillusionment with the outcome of the war marked a turning point. In the hospital, upon learning of the surrender, he expressed a mix of disbelief, anger, and a sense of betrayal. This episode was the beginning of his hatred toward the politicians who signed the armistice and, later, toward the movements he held responsible for Germany's collapse. For him, the defeat was not due to military inferiority but to a stab in the back from within. That narrative, which he adopted from the end of the conflict, later became one of the central ideas of his political speeches. His time in the war, far from being a passing episode, was the formative core of his future identity. Although he had begun as an enthusiastic volunteer, he ended up as a disillusioned survivor, marked by loss and convinced that there had to be a way to restore Germany's honor at any cost. Fact 5. For almost 7 years, Hitler was stateless without citizenship. At the beginning of 1925, Adolf Hitler decided to formally renounce his Austrian nationality. The request was accepted in April of that same year, which meant that he ceased to be affiliated with any state. From that moment, his legal situation was in complete limbo. He was not a citizen of either Austria or Germany. Technically, he became stateless. From then on, for almost 7 years, he lived and acted politically in Germany without having a recognized nationality. During that time, he tried on several occasions to obtain German citizenship, but all efforts failed. There were documented attempts in different regions, such as in Hildburghausen or in the state of Thuringia. However, in all cases, legal obstacles or local political resistance were encountered. None of those attempts were successful. The situation changed in February 1932, when the leaders of the National Socialist Party already had influence in some German states. In Braunschweig, a small regional state, the party had secured a strong position within the local government. Thanks to that position, a mechanism was organized to resolve Hitler's situation. On the 25th of February of that year, he was granted a post as an official of the Braunschweig state government in its Berlin delegation. That public office automatically gave him the citizenship of the state and, with it, German nationality at the national level. The procedure was a legally valid route, though clearly motivated by political interests. From that moment on, Hitler became officially a German citizen. The acquisition of nationality took place just a few weeks before the presidential elections, in which he could run for the first time as a legally qualified candidate. If that step had not been achieved, he would not have been able to compete. In the previous years, while he was stateless, Hitler remained active within the party and took part in public events, but without being legally qualified as a citizen. That condition did not prevent him from acting, but it did limit his ability to hold official positions or run for elections. The solution of 1932 removed that barrier just in time to facilitate his next political step. The story of those years without citizenship was not widely known to the public at the time, but it was a key detail that made a decisive difference in his rise. It was an exceptional situation for someone who only a few months later would occupy the highest position in the country. Fact 6. The rumor was true, but only partly. Hitler had cryptorchidism. One of the most widespread rumors about Hitler, perhaps the most caricatured of all, is that he had only one testicle. During the Second World War, this idea became part of British folklore and was even turned into a song. Allied soldiers marched to the rhythm of the Colonel Bogey March, mockingly chanting, "Hitler has only got one ball." What seemed like propaganda humor ended up revealing, decades later, a medical basis, though not exactly as it was believed. In 1923, after the failed coup he organized in Munich, Hitler was imprisoned in Landsberg, Bavaria. There, on November 12th, the prison doctor, Josef Brinsteiner, carried out a routine physical examination. The result was recorded in an official report where it was stated that prisoner number 45, Adolf Hitler, was in generally good health, but suffered from something called right-sided cryptorchidism, meaning that one of his testicles had not descended into the scrotum. The finding was confirmed by historian Peter Fleischmann, who investigated and collected original documents of the time in his book Hitler as a Prisoner in Landsberg am Lech, 1923/24. The medical record was part of a batch of 500 documents that came to public light only in 2010, after having remained hidden for more than 8 decades. These files were seized by the German government before being auctioned and are today preserved as historical material. Although the fact confirms that Hitler had only one functional testicle, it also discredits another theory, the one that claimed he had lost it during the First World War due to a grenade wound. The 1923 medical report, predating those versions, demonstrates that his condition was congenital and not the result of combat. The most curious aspect is how this intimate detail, at first used to ridicule him, ended up generating almost morbid interest in later years. For obvious reasons, no serious biographer focused on that aspect. However, what seemed like vulgar gossip turned out to have documentary and medical backing. Moreover, the medical report was not the only interesting finding about his time in prison. Fleischmann discovered that Hitler enjoyed privileged treatment during his imprisonment. He was addressed as Sir, received special food prepared outside the prison kitchen, and even wrote his book Mein Kampf there. His cell was comfortable, his visits were numerous, more than 330 people, and he even staged a brief hunger strike at the beginning. But all that, although relevant, pales in comparison with the fact that the myth of the single testicle has at least a real basis. Fact 7. Hitler's personal doctor turned him into a habitual drug user. In the last years of the war, when the Third Reich was beginning to crumble, Adolf Hitler was no longer the same man who had unleashed the conflict in 1939. Although publicly he continued to present himself as the firm and unquestionable leader of the German people, in the intimacy of his bunker and before the small circle of his closest collaborators, his physical and mental decline became increasingly evident. One of the most striking elements explaining that deterioration was his deep dependence on medications regularly supplied by his personal doctor, Dr. Theodor Morell. What began as a supposedly harmless medical routine became a complex and dangerous daily cocktail of chemical substances that altered his body and mind. Morell regularly administered vitamins, hormonal supplements, stimulants, sedatives, laxatives, and other preparations. At first glance, many of these drugs seemed harmless, but taken together and in such frequency, they represented a ticking time bomb for any organism. As the military situation worsened, so too did the Führer's anxiety, leading him to demand his daily doses more urgently, which included intravenous injections with animal extracts and compounds such as glucose, caffeine, euphoric agents, and morphine derivatives. One of the most striking moments was in September 1944, when Hitler fell ill with severe stomach pains. Instead of turning to other doctors of the regime, he relied exclusively on Morell, who administered a mixture of antibacterial medication, animal extracts, and revitalizing injections. Although his health improved for a time, the tremors in his left hand, his difficulty walking, and his increasingly lost gaze became impossible for those close to him to ignore. Albert Speer and other members of his inner circle noticed that his behavior was erratic, with sudden mood swings, bursts of unjustified euphoria, and later periods of extreme irritability, which even made military meetings difficult. Morell's own diary meticulously documents the substances administered. Among them were Pervitin, a methamphetamine widely used by the German army, which in Hitler's case was applied to combat fatigue, and Eucadol, an opiate derivative that relieved pain but created dependence. Added to this were treatments with animal hormones and testicular extracts aimed at restoring physical vigor, along with products to relieve chronic constipation, which became a daily concern inside the bunker. The cumulative effect of all these substances was devastating. Hitler seemed increasingly disconnected from reality, unable to make coherent decisions, and obsessed with imagined betrayals. Despite the advice of some collaborators, he never replaced Morell. The blind trust he placed in him, even when his methods were questioned by other Nazi doctors, ultimately sealed his dependency and irreversibly marked his final downfall. Fact 8. Hitler's guilty pleasure. His excessive addiction to sugar. Far from the severe asceticism with which many have tried to cloak his figure, Adolf Hitler developed an unhealthy relationship with sugar that directly contradicted the image of self-discipline he himself promoted. His obsession with sweets was more than a simple preference. It turned into a manifest and constant addiction, which grew stronger as his physical and mental health began to deteriorate over the years. In particular, during the Second World War, reports agree that Hitler consumed enormous amounts of sugar in all its forms, from cakes and pies to cookies, chocolates and jams that he demanded to have always at hand, regardless of the context or the medical recommendations that tried to restrict it. Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, acknowledged with frustration that his patient was practically insatiable when it came to sweets. Morell, who supervised his diet and pharmacological regime on a daily basis, warned that sugar, added to the cocktail of medications, injections, and pills administered at an alarming frequency, not only contradicted the health principles the Führer claimed to uphold, but also dangerously altered his emotional and digestive stability. Hitler's dependence on this type of food grew in parallel with his isolation from the real world, increasingly locked inside his bunker, increasingly disconnected from his generals and from the war reality. He found in sugar a childish escape valve that, though seemingly trivial, faithfully reflected his psychological state. Witnesses from his close environment describe unusual scenes. While German cities were being bombed and millions were dying on the Eastern Front, Hitler could spend afternoons devouring cream cakes, sugary pastries, or plates full of candied fruits while interrupting his monotonous tirades with comments about how delicious he found the taste of sugar. Even at crucial moments of military decisions, he asked to be accompanied by trays of sweets, something that often perplexed diplomats, collaborators, or visitors who could not understand how someone so obsessed with control could show such dependence on a basic weakness. The most striking thing is that this inclination was not just a whim, it was part of an obsessive routine. Hitler could go hours without eating solid food, but he invariably demanded coffee with cream and sugar, cakes, chocolate bars, and industrial sweets. According to medical records, Hitler's sugar consumption far exceeded the levels considered safe, and his pancreas and digestive system were affected towards the end of the war, when his energy levels were already being artificially sustained by intravenous glucose and other stimulants. Far from being an anecdotal detail, his addiction to sugar reveals a deeper and more disturbing facet of his personality. That dissonance between the myth he built about himself and his most pathetic private habits. The man who promoted purity, strength, and sacrifice was, in private, dependent on sugar, an infantilized adult who needed cakes as much as absolute power. Fact 9. The paradox of an outsider in command. The hidden symbol behind Hitler's non-German origin. Few ironies of history are as profound and symbolically powerful as this. The man who embodied the most extreme German nationalism, who built a regime based on ethnic purity and German pride, was not even born in Germany. For years, this was no secret, but it was deliberately ignored by millions of Germans, and its symbolic weight was rarely acknowledged in public. However, for many outside Germany and for later analysts, Hitler's original nationality has represented an uncomfortable and revealing anomaly. How could a foreigner become the absolute leader of the country that preached the supremacy of the German race? The cultural impact of this fact does not lie in its simple legal statement, but in everything it represents. Germany, humiliated after the First World War, was going through an identity crisis and desperately sought a figure to restore its lost pride. That this role was assumed by a man born in another country was not seen as a contradiction, but as irrelevant amid political fervor. Yet that omission says much more than it seems. Hitler's legal nationality was completely subordinated to the myth he himself knew how to construct. The Führer was neither Austrian, nor German, nor Bavarian. He was an idealized embodiment of a people he himself molded through his speeches, his symbols, and his rhetoric. Historically, this situation demonstrates the enormous power propaganda can have in reshaping collective perception. Germans did not need Hitler to be technically German to see him as the redeemer of their nation. And beyond the practical, his late citizenship, his Austro-Hungarian past, his years as a stateless man, what mattered was that his origin was absorbed, silenced, or reinterpreted to fit the national narrative. That an Austrian not only led Germany but dragged all of Europe into war in the name of the German people reveals how legal borders can become invisible when collective emotions take control. Even in the cultural sphere, this contradiction has been explored time and again. Writers, historians, and filmmakers have pointed out the paradox that the architect of an ideology of exclusion and racial purity was, strictly speaking, an outsider. In Austria, his birthplace, this relationship has been a source of discomfort for decades, with monuments removed, plaques modified, and public memory marked by the need to disassociate from his figure. In Germany, on the other hand, the issue was ignored during the regime, and only after the war did it begin to be analyzed as a revealing element of the collective delusion that surrounded him. In the end, more than a biographical fact, the reality that Hitler was not German has become a symbol, proof of how ideology can surpass reality, of how a desperate people can project their identity onto an outsider, and of how history does not always follow the logic of passports, but that of myths. Fact 10. His absolute hatred of tobacco, the Führer who promoted the first major anti-smoking campaign of the 20th century. During his youth, Adolf Hitler was a heavy smoker, consuming an estimated 25 to 40 cigarettes a day. However, at some early point in his political career, he abandoned the habit, declaring it an unnecessary expense. From then on, he developed a deep and obsessive rejection of tobacco to the point of turning this aversion into an active part of his social and public health policies. In his intimate circles, he harshly censured those who smoked, even when they were key figures within the Nazi regime, such as his partner Eva Braun or Hermann Göring himself. On one occasion, he was even upset because a statue had been commissioned showing Göring smoking a cigar. Hitler saw smoking not only as a personal weakness, but also as a symbol of moral decadence. He described tobacco as the wrath of the Redskins against the white man, in revenge for having given them strong liquors, and lamented the loss of valuable soldiers due to tobacco poisoning. This repulsion went beyond the personal. In the midst of the Second World War, on March 2, 1942, he declared that allowing soldiers to smoke had been a leadership mistake and promised to ban tobacco consumption in the army once the war was over. He considered that no soldier should depend on cigarettes to function. The anti-smoking campaign promoted in Nazi Germany was paradoxically one of the most advanced in the world at the time. Hitler was the first modern head of state to openly position himself against cigarettes. He supported advertising restrictions for tobacco companies, tax increases on tobacco, and bans on smoking in public places such as hospitals, buses, and workplaces. His regime also financed medical studies linking smoking to lung cancer and other diseases, many of which were decades ahead of medical conclusions in other countries. In parallel, campaigns were launched focusing on women. From the Nazi Party's Office of Racial Policy, it was warned that women who smoked were less attractive, more prone to premature aging, and poor candidates for motherhood. They even argued that nicotine passed into breast milk, something later confirmed by scientific studies. The racial hygienist Martin Stemmler, as well as Dr. Agnes Blum, claimed that pregnant smokers had higher rates of miscarriages and stillbirths. These concerns fit with the regime's obsession with maximizing the fertility of German women. Although his motivation to fight smoking was born from a combination of personal beliefs, eugenics, and ideological propaganda, it is nevertheless significant that Hitler laid the foundations for what, many decades later, would become common public health policies throughout much of the world. In a context where smoking was still a symbol of modernity and virility, the dictator's radically anti-tobacco stance contrasted with the culture of his time and ultimately influenced even later health discourses. Fact 11. Hitler survived more than 40 assassination attempts. Throughout his rule, Adolf Hitler was the target of an impressive number of assassination attempts. Various reports from military archives, intelligence documents, and the memoirs of those involved record more than 40 attempts, some serious, others clumsy or aborted at the last minute, to kill him. This constant level of threat not only reveals the degree of opposition that existed within the Reich itself, but also the perception that eliminating him could radically change the course of the war and of the Nazi regime. One of the first serious attempts occurred as early as 1939, when Georg Elser, a Swabian carpenter, placed a time bomb in the Bürgerbräukeller beer hall in Munich, where Hitler gave his annual commemorative speech for the failed coup of 1923. The device exploded as planned, but Hitler had left the venue 13 minutes earlier due to an unexpected schedule change. The explosion killed 8 people and injured dozens more, but the target escaped unscathed. Elsa was captured that same night and, after years of detention, was executed at Dachau in 1945, shortly before the end of the regime. However, the most well-known plot was that of July 20, 1944. On that day, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg managed to place a briefcase bomb in the conference room of Hitler's headquarters, the so-called Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. The plan was to detonate the device, kill Hitler, and launch Operation Valkyrie, a takeover of power by the regular army, displacing the SS and dismantling the Nazi dictatorship. The explosion occurred, but Hitler survived with minor injuries, mainly because the briefcase had been moved behind a thick oak table leg that absorbed part of the blast. This failed attack triggered brutal repression. Hundreds of officers, politicians, lawyers, clergy, and civilians were arrested, tortured, and executed. The repressive apparatus was further reinforced, and Hitler, convinced of betrayal even within his own ranks, sank into even deeper paranoia. He began to see enemies everywhere, tightened security measures to extreme levels, and further restricted his circle of trust. His meetings became shorter, more random and unpredictable, and were rarely announced in advance. But beyond the immediate impact, the existence of so many assassination attempts and the magnitude of the July 20th plot reveal an often silenced element. Within Germany, even within the army and the Nazi Party, there was active resistance. These conspirators were not communists or allied agents. They were conservative Germans, nationalists, and even members of the military aristocracy who believed that Hitler was leading the country to total destruction. The fact that Hitler survived so many attempts reinforced his own idea of invulnerability. According to testimonies from his close circle, he came to believe that a divine hand was protecting him, which fueled his messianic delusion and his contempt for the advice of his generals, whom he already considered weak or disloyal. In the Nazi imagination, Hitler began to represent an almost supernatural symbol, which further consolidated his authority among those who still believed in him. Thus, these were not only failed assassination attempts, but episodes that profoundly altered the structure of Nazi power, reinforced internal repression, weakened trust within the army, and helped consolidate the cult of Hitler's personality even as the Third Reich began to collapse. Fact 12. A wedding amid the ruins, Hitler and Eva Braun's final marriage. On the night of April 28th to 29th, 1945, in the cramped underground bunker of the Reich Chancellery, while Berlin burned under Soviet fire and the forces of the Third Reich collapsed on all fronts, Adolf Hitler made a decision that no one in his closest circle had anticipated: to marry Eva Braun. By then, everything was lost. The Red Army was already just a few hundred meters from his shelter. Yet in the midst of that total disaster, Hitler decided to carry out a profoundly personal and symbolic act, which for many revealed the mixture of theatrical control, emotional need, and narcissism with which he conducted his final actions. Despite having been in an informal relationship with Eva Braun for nearly 15 years, he had never made their bond public or allowed it to be formalized in any way. Only at that final moment, before the certainty of defeat and death, did he agree to do so. The act was intimate and brief. In one of the bunker's rooms, hastily decorated, the civil ceremony was held. A regime official, Walter Wagner, was urgently summoned to register the marriage and ask both witnesses, Goebbels and Bormann, to sign. The atmosphere could not have been further from that of a traditional wedding. The place smelled of fuel and damp. The ceilings vibrated with nearby bombardments, and those present knew that they would probably all be dead within hours or days. Nevertheless, Hitler seemed determined to follow the marriage protocol, even insisting that Eva explicitly declare she had no Jewish ancestry, as Nazi law required. That same night, after a brief toast and an improvised breakfast, Hitler dictated his political and personal will, another act of will aimed at perpetuating his worldview even after his death. The marriage was neither a romantic gesture, nor a reconciliation with life, nor a search for redemption. It was, above all, a final affirmation of control in a moment of absolute collapse. In his will, Hitler made clear that Eva Braun had been his loyal companion and that, with her death, she would also seal her fate with that of the Reich. The next day, April 30th, they fulfilled that purpose. After saying goodbye to their staff, they locked themselves in the Führer's study, sat side by side on the sofa, and died together. She took cyanide. He shot himself in the temple. Their bodies were quickly wrapped, doused in gasoline, and burned, as he had previously ordered, to prevent them from being captured by the Soviets and displayed as trophies. This brief marriage, lasting barely 40 hours, carries a symbolic weight that has been widely debated by historians. For some, it was a way of legitimizing Eva Braun's role in the history of the Third Reich. For others, a melodramatic gesture of a dictator obsessed with rituals and staging. But there are those who see in it a purely human act, the need on the eve of death to establish an intimate and recognized connection with the only person who had been unconditionally faithful to him for years. Eva Braun had no political role, never participated in regime decisions, nor publicly influenced the circles of power, but her presence in the final bunker made her a silent symbol of loyalty and denial. The most ironic thing is that Hitler, who had built all his power on the image of the celibate leader devoted only to the German people, ended his life by breaking that myth he had so carefully cultivated. For years, he had refused to publicly acknowledge Eva because he believed Germans needed to see him as a man without emotional distractions. But in the end, when there were no cameras or crowds left to deceive, he decided to marry her, not out of political necessity, but out of an intimate and desperate choice. That final gesture has been interpreted as a demonstration of his total isolation. With the world collapsing, the only thing he could still control was the way he would die and with whom. Their brief marriage did not change the course of history, but it did add another layer to the psychological portrait of a man who, even in absolute defeat, refused to accept any external imposition. He died as he wished, beside the one he chose, leaving behind an unprecedented trail of destruction. But that wedding, celebrated amid the roar of bombs and the shadow of suicide, remains one of the most unsettling moments of his final days. A symbol of humanity distorted by ideology, of love reduced to a closing ritual, and of power clung to until the very last breath. Fact 13. Obsession with numbers, Hitler's numerical superstition. Adolf Hitler was not only a dictator obsessed with power, race, and territorial domination, but also a man trapped in a world of superstitions, especially with regard to numbers. Although direct evidence of how this obsession influenced each of his decisions is not conclusive, those around him perceived a constant tendency to attribute symbolic and spiritual value to certain numbers and key dates in his life. Hitler's fascination with numerology was not isolated within the Third Reich. Part of the Nazi inner circle shared similar beliefs connected with occultism, mystical forces, and the search for meaning in seemingly invisible patterns. One of the numbers that most symbolically marked the Nazi universe was 88. In the party's internal code, that number was not accidental. Each 8 represented the 8th letter of the alphabet, H. So 88 meant Heil Hitler, a salute that became a sign of absolute loyalty to the Führer. It was not only a form of greeting or a symbolic expression. The number 88 was replicated in uniforms, insignia, and other propaganda elements, showing that this numerical code had been institutionalized at the highest levels of Nazi power as a secret, almost ritualistic wink toward its leader. Another particularly significant number was 3. In many religions and esoteric systems, 3 is associated with perfection, trinity, and stability, and Hitler also seemed to adopt it as a symbol of structural purity. He conceived the ideal Aryan race as a supposed fusion among Germanic, Scandinavian, and Celtic peoples, forming an ethnic triad that fit that triangular symbolic structure. This idea of 3 as a key constructive number was also reflected in his rhetoric. He considered that only a base with 3 pillars could support a stable society, and he often organized his speeches, ideals, or organizational structures in sets of 3. The relationship with the number 666, associated in the Judeo-Christian tradition with the Antichrist or forces of evil, is also revealing. While there is no record that Hitler used it openly in public, some analysts have interpreted its symbolic use as a tool of fear. It was said that some Nazi propaganda elements incorporated it indirectly, especially when projecting a demonic and invincible image of the Reich to the regime's enemies. The intention was to instill psychological terror, giving Hitler an almost supernatural and untouchable aura, as if his power came from a dark, incomprehensible source. Even his date of birth, April 20th, 1889, has been subject to numerological analysis. Adding the digits of the date yields a total of 33, a number associated in various esoteric traditions with wisdom, enlightenment, and spiritual leadership. Some of his most fervent followers came to consider that coincidence as a predestined sign, interpreting the figure as an indication that Hitler was called to fulfill a transcendent mission. Although these interpretations border on the mystical and the pseudoscientific, it cannot be denied that many within the Nazi circle encouraged such symbolic readings as a way to reinforce the Führer's messianic image. Within the Nazi Party, the systematic use of certain numbers to reinforce the regime's symbolic discourse also spread. The number 12, for example, was adopted as a representation of purity and perfection associated with the 12 original Aryan tribes in the Nazi racial myth. It has also been suggested that some strategic decisions, such as scheduling events or setting dates for speeches or parades, were influenced by these numerological beliefs. Although there is no conclusive documentary proof, the consistent symbolic use of numbers in public acts, celebrations, and propaganda suggests that the regime, and especially Hitler, took into account more than mere coincidences. Moreover, the very name Adolf, according to certain numerological interpretations, carries significant symbolic weight. In some versions of Western numerology, each letter is assigned a numerical value and, in the case of Adolf, a total of 39 is obtained. Those who defend these theories claim that this number encapsulates traits of leadership, ambition, individualism, and determination, characteristics that matched the image Hitler projected and wanted to reinforce among his followers. This set of obsessions and associations among numbers, symbols, and esoteric concepts cannot be separated from the ideological structure of the Third Reich. The need to justify irrational or immoral actions by means of symbolic elements was not only a strategy of external manipulation, but also an internal attempt to provide spiritual coherence to a deeply violent and totalitarian project. In other words, numerical superstition was not a simple whim, but part of the machinery that kept the regime's mystical narrative alive. However, it is crucial to stress that all these elements lack scientific backing and fall within the realm of pseudoscience. Numerology has no empirical validity to explain human behavior, but in the case of Nazism, its use served as an ideological tool to bolster fanaticism. In this context, superstition with numbers was less a personal belief and more a functional component of the Nazi propaganda apparatus, a way to cloak the regime's decisions in mystery, grandeur, and an aura of inevitable destiny within a project obsessed with the symbolic and psychological control of the masses. Fact 14. He lived as a destitute in Vienna. Between 1909 and 1913, Adolf Hitler went through a period of his life deeply marked by poverty and social marginalization in the city of Vienna. Although he later tried to soften or even distort these years in his autobiographical accounts, the reality documented by biographers such as Ian Kershaw, Joachim Fest, and Volker Ulrich reveals that Hitler spent several winters sleeping in municipal shelters for the homeless, such as the one in Meidling, and survived by selling postcards he painted himself. His dream of becoming a recognized artist had been crushed after being rejected twice by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, and that blow not only cut short his professional aspiration, but also pushed him into a spiral of frustration, resentment, and isolation. During those years, Hitler had no steady job, no fixed income, and no influential contacts. He spent much of the day in public libraries or cafes, reading newspapers, rehearsing political and artistic ideas, or simply observing the social life of a city that was at once cosmopolitan and unequal. Vienna of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a hotbed of national, social, and cultural tensions. Germans, Czechs, Jews, Hungarians, Slavs, and other groups coexisted in a city of great artistic wealth, but also of deep class and national divisions. It was in this context that Hitler began to develop a distorted worldview. His anti-Semitism intensified, as did his contempt for Marxism and liberal democracy, and he nurtured a romantic idea of German nationalism. Nonetheless, it should be noted that during that period he did not actively participate in any political movement. He simply absorbed influences, many of them taken from anti-Semitic pamphlets or from radical authors such as Lanz von Liebenfels or Karl Lueger, the mayor of Vienna, who had skillfully exploited anti-Semitism as a political weapon. The contradiction lay in the fact that Hitler, who lived off the public welfare system and occasionally the charity of some Viennese Jews, was beginning to cultivate a hatred that years later would make him one of the most ruthless executioners of that same group. Years later, already as Germany's chancellor, Hitler rarely spoke about his time in Vienna, and when he did, it was to portray that time as a period of austere, almost mystical formation. In practice, however, those years were nothing more than a constant struggle to survive, without a home of his own and with the daily humiliation of having failed to achieve the artistic success he so desired. It was in those cold shelters, in worn-out clothes and under a deep sense of failure, that a persona began to take shape who, far from surrendering to adversity, fed a morbid resentment that he would later channel into the German political stage. This period not only shaped him ideologically, but also molded his personality. He became more solitary, more distrustful, more obsessed with the idea of a personal mission and with hatred as a driver of change. Many historians agree that without those years of absolute poverty in Vienna, Hitler probably would never have radicalized to the extent he did. There, not only was a dictator in the making forged, but also a man who learned to camouflage his personal failure under a narrative of future greatness, and who found in resentment an inexhaustible source of energy for his later political rise. Fact 15. Hitler's systematic hatred toward homosexuals. Although often hidden in the more popular accounts of Nazism, one of the groups most fiercely persecuted by Adolf Hitler's regime was that of homosexuals, particularly men. This persecution was not an isolated phenomenon nor merely motivated by personal prejudice, but a fully designed state policy, executed with brutality and justified with pseudo-scientific and legal arguments. Hitler not only shared the most reactionary ideas about homosexuality, but turned his contempt into a repressive tool that affected the lives of tens of thousands of people, especially during the years of the Third Reich. Long before the Nazis came to power, there was already an article in the German Penal Code number 175, which criminalized sexual relations between men. Although that article already limited the rights of LGBT+ people, during the Weimar Republic movements emerged fighting for its repeal, such as the Scientific Humanitarian Committee founded by sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld. Berlin in the 1920s became a vibrant and relatively open city regarding homosexual visibility. There were cafes, clubs, publications, scientific institutions, and activists defending decriminalization and promoting recognition of sexual diversity. But Hitler's rise to power in 1933 destroyed that flourishing movement. Not only did he halt the advance toward tolerance, but he hardened existing legislation and turned Article 175 into an instrument of terror. The Nazis not only applied the law, but reformed it to allow persecution of any type of contact between men, even without sexual consummation. According to estimates, around 100,000 men were arrested under that regulation, and between 5,000 and 15,000 ended up in concentration camps. There, they were identified with a pink triangle sewn onto their uniform, a mark that made them targets of torture, humiliation, and medical experiments. The case of Friedrich Paul von Grossheim is one among thousands. Arrested several times, he was forced to undergo castration to obtain his freedom. Others were used as guinea pigs, subjected to inhuman cures, or simply murdered. In the camps, homosexuals suffered violence not only from Nazi guards, but also from other prisoners, encouraged by a hierarchy of suffering that placed those with the pink triangle at the very bottom. Hitler's homophobia was not just a personal prejudice, but part of his racist and eugenic worldview. He considered homosexuality a threat to the reproduction of the Aryan race and a corrupting element of German morality. In this framework, there was no room for any form of affective or sexual diversity, which was seen as decadence. The most paradoxical element, however, is that within the Nazi Party itself, there were homosexual members who were purged when they were no longer useful, such as Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA, assassinated during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. His sexuality was one of the arguments Hitler used to justify his execution, in a clear example of how homophobia could be used as a political weapon even against former allies. The Nazi regime destroyed the entire infrastructure of the pre-existing homosexual movement. In May 1933, the Institute of Sexual Research was looted and its books burned in Opera Square. Magnus Hirschfeld was abroad and never returned. He died in exile. With him disappeared one of the main scientific voices defending homosexuality as a natural variant of human condition. From then on, every trace of tolerance was erased, and those who had formed part of that early activism were forced to hide, marry forcibly, or flee. Even after the end of the war, Germany did not recognize homosexuals as victims of Nazism. They received neither compensation nor tributes for decades. Article 175 remained in force until 1994, and only in recent years has there been a minimal effort to repair that historical injustice. Meanwhile, the pink triangle that marked them as enemies of the Reich has been re-signified as a symbol of pride and memory by LGBT+ communities, reminding the world that institutionalized hatred not only kills but silences entire generations who dared to be different in the darkest time in history. Fact 16. Hitler's strange admiration for Disney and Snow White. Despite the dark and ruthless image surrounding the German dictator, one of the most surprising and seemingly contradictory details of his personal life is his deep fascination with the world of Disney. This curiosity, which might seem like a mere anecdote, takes on special relevance when considering the ideological and political context that defined his public life. Hitler's interest in animated films, especially Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, is documented through sketches found among his belongings, showing that he himself drew characters from the film, indicating a genuine and personal fondness for this production. Accounts from those close to him note that the film released by Walt Disney in 1937 was one of his favorites. This pioneering animation not only entertained him, but also inspired him artistically, which aligns with his well-known fondness for drawing. Although much of his earlier pictorial work focused on landscapes and architecture, this kind of interest in animation and fairy tale characters reveals an unusual facet of his personality, seemingly disconnected from the brutality and coldness with which he acted in the political and military arena. The detail gains further depth when considering Disney's place within American culture, which Hitler publicly despised in numerous speeches. Nevertheless, his attraction to this kind of American artistic expression shows a dissonance between his private preferences and his ideological rhetoric. It is not an isolated case among dictators with double aesthetic standards, but it remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the character. Despite publicly abhorring what he considered the cultural degeneration of the Western enemy, in the privacy of his personal life he seemed to take pleasure in a children's tale based on simple values of goodness and justice. Admiration for Disney also highlights his need for escape from the constant tension he experienced as a public figure. It is possible that, like many people, he found in these stories a kind of emotional refuge, a temporary distraction from reality, or even a way to reconnect with repressed aspects of his youth. Fact 17. He never visited a concentration camp, neither out of curiosity nor for supervision. Despite being the supreme leader of the Third Reich and the ultimate authority behind the concentration camp system, Adolf Hitler never set foot in one. This assertion is supported not only by the complete absence of documentary or photographic records of such a visit, but also by the analysis of his leadership style, political priorities, and the internal tensions of the Nazi apparatus. From the early days of the regime, camps like Dachau were not secret. On the contrary, they were publicized as centers to re-educate enemies of the people. However, beyond this initial stage, the propagandistic utility of a Hitler visit became null, especially once the true purpose of the camps shifted to extermination. During the Holocaust, the most important decisions were made verbally, leaving no direct trace that could implicate Hitler. He was fully aware of what was happening, but he completely delegated the administration of the camps to Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS. It was Himmler who carried out inspections and oversaw reports. In fact, it is known that during a visit to Minsk in 1941, Himmler witnessed a mass massacre of Jews by the Einsatzgruppen and was so shaken that he promoted the use of gas chambers to ease the task of the executioners. Furthermore, Hitler was notoriously reluctant to conduct on-site inspections even at the military front, so there was no reason for him to appear in camps considered SS territory, especially when the different factions of the Third Reich competed for control and sought his validation. A visit by him would have meant political endorsement of one faction, something he always avoided in order not to disrupt the fragile balance of power. In summary, Hitler never visited a concentration camp not out of ignorance or moral distance, but simply because he had no need to. He knew what was happening, had people to inform him, gained nothing in propaganda terms, and governed by letting others carry out his will while he remained removed from logistical details. A comfortable distance that did not absolve him of responsibility, but allowed him to avoid direct contact with the machinery of horror he himself had ordered into motion. Fact 18. Bull semen, the strange reinforcement Hitler received to boost his virility. During the last years of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler underwent a series of unconventional treatments administered by his personal physician, Theodor Gilbert Morell, a controversial figure who earned the dictator's complete trust after successfully treating a stomach ailment in 1936. From that day on, Morell became an omnipresent figure at his side, despite warnings from generals and high-ranking officials who considered him a charlatan. Among the many substances Morell regularly administered to Hitler, one of the most striking was a formula supposedly designed to strengthen his sexual potency. This mixture included vitamins, hormones, animal extracts, enzymes, and particularly bull semen, which was injected especially before nights Hitler spent with Eva Braun. The idea behind this procedure was to symbolically transfer the bull's strength and virility to the Führer himself. These practices not only reflect Morell's pseudoscientific view of medicine, but also the regime's obsession with health, energy, and male vigor, especially among its figures of power. Bull semen, considered a symbol of fertility and animal strength, was part of a long list of remedies intended to keep Hitler active, alert, and physically prepared amid the exhaustion caused by the war, political pressure, and his increasingly visible ailments. Morell's medical diary recorded in detail the injections and pills he administered daily. In addition to this peculiar extract, the substances included components such as testosterone, lipids, proteins, and glandular derivatives. Although many of these treatments lacked scientific support, Hitler placed absolute trust in his doctor, even ignoring the criticism he received from his inner circle. This dependence on Morell was so strong that even as Hitler's physical condition visibly deteriorated and his left hand began to tremble uncontrollably, he continued to rely on the injections as if they were the key to his vitality. In his final days in the bunker, he was still receiving those mixtures, convinced that they would help him endure. Fact 19. The radical defender of animals, Hitler and his obsessive animal protection. Although his name would forever be engraved as a synonym for brutality and extermination, Adolf Hitler was also responsible for one of the strictest animal welfare policies of the 20th century. His concern was neither decorative nor symbolic. From the earliest days of the Nazi regime, he and his closest collaborators imposed a set of laws that protected animals with an unusual severity for the time. In his diaries, Joseph Goebbels noted that Hitler despised Judeo-Christian religions, among other reasons, because of the moral hierarchy that placed humans above animals. The Führer believed that animal suffering should be avoided for the sake of the animals themselves, not as an extension of human interests. Under his direction, vivisection was banned in 1933, and strict rules were introduced against slaughter without anesthesia. Following Hitler's direct orders, Hermann Göring announced in a radio broadcast that those who mistreated animals would be sent to concentration camps. Excessive hunting, traps, the force-feeding of birds, and the consumption of lobsters or crabs were also prohibited. Even a fisherman was arrested for having used a frog as bait. In 1934, animal protection was included as a compulsory subject in German public schools, and in 1935, a law was enacted to preserve nature and restrict hunting. Despite the moral contradictions of his regime, Hitler promoted advanced legislation in animal protection. Many historians interpret these laws as part of a worldview where biology and symbolism dangerously intertwined, but the fact remains that his regime was the first to legislate the protection of wolves and to grant legal status to the defense of animal welfare for its own intrinsic value. Fact 20. Hitler rehearsed his speeches by photographing himself in different poses to perfect his public image beyond verbal content. The German dictator deeply understood the importance of body language and visual imagery to manipulate the masses. That is why, before appearing in public, he intensely practiced every gesture, every movement of his hands, and every facial expression in front of a trusted photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann. During these private sessions, Hitler ordered himself to be photographed while executing his most dramatic gestures, raising his arm, extending his hand, leaning his torso, or frowning. These images were not meant to be published, but to serve as a guide. He analyzed them himself, carefully observing how each pose looked, what it conveyed, and what needed correction. His goal was to refine to the smallest detail the scenic impact of his presence, achieving a visual communication that perfectly accompanied his words and emotionally moved his audience. This method reveals not only great narcissism, but also a very clear understanding of the mechanisms of modern propaganda. Hitler left nothing to chance in his construction as a charismatic leader. He knew that the strength of a speech did not lie only in what was said, but in how it was said. Pauses, gestures, posture, gaze. Everything was part of a carefully calculated performance. Although some of these photographs were destroyed at his request, several survived and today stand as visual evidence of that controlling and theatrical facet. They showed a man who, far from spontaneity, sought to become an almost mythological figure through rehearsal, repetition, and the meticulous manipulation of his image.